Some of the things that we found, which are shocking, billions and billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think it's very important. And that's one of the reasons I got elected. I say we're going to do that. Nobody had any idea it was that bad, that sick, and that corrupt. And it seems hard to believe that judges want to try and stop us from looking for corruption, especially when we found hundreds of millions of dollars worth, much more than that, in just a short period of time. And we want to weed out the corruption. And it seems hard to believe that a judge could say, we don't want you to do that. Well, so maybe we have to look at the judges, because that's a very serious, I think it's a very serious violation.
Okay, so imagine this scenario. You pack the Supreme Court with justices who you appointed. You spent years making sure you had a solid conservative majority that would back your agenda. You literally got 3 justices on that court because you nominated them. And then one day you decide you're going to use an emergency law from 1977 to slap hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs on everything coming into the country. You think these justices are going to back you up because you put them there, right? Wrong, dead wrong. Because in early November, during oral arguments over these tariffs, the justices that Trump himself appointed stood up and said, hold on, this is unconstitutional, this is presidential overreach, this is not what that emergency law allows you to do. And it wasn't just the liberal justices either, it was conservative justices, it was Neil Gorsuch, it was Amy Coney Barrett, it was justices that Trump handpicked. And they absolutely grilled the Trump administration's lawyer about whether Trump has the authority to do what he's doing. This is absolutely wild. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Testimony is underway in the 3rd week of the criminal hush money trial involving former President Donald Trump. Today, the judge in the case held Trump in contempt of court for violating a gag order. Judge Juan Merchan says Trump violated the order not 1, but 9 times and fined him, well, $1,000 each, total of $9,000.
Think about what this means. Trump thought he owned the Supreme Court. He thought his justices would rubber stamp whatever he wanted to do. But instead, they're telling him no. They're telling him the Constitution actually matters. They're telling him he can't just declare an emergency and bypass Congress and slap tariffs on everything. And this is coming from justices that Trump appointed. That's the shock moment. That's what's got Washington in panic mode right now. Because if Trump can't count on his own justices to back him up, then what does that mean for his entire agenda? What does that mean for his ability to wield executive power? Come on, this is a fundamental moment where the checks and balances system is actually working. Here's what happened on November 5th. The Supreme Court held oral arguments over whether Trump's tariffs are legal. And during those arguments, multiple justices went after the Trump administration's lawyer. They asked hard questions. They challenged the legal theory. They basically said, where is Congress in all this? Where is the authority coming from? A 1977 emergency law that was designed for specific things like sending troops abroad or dealing with foreign threats. Does that law really let a president slap tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of imports without congressional approval? The answer from the justices seemed to be no, and not just the liberal justices. Conservative justices were asking these questions too, and that's the part that matters most, because if the conservatives are skeptical, then Trump could lose. Trump could actually lose in his own Supreme Court. That's the situation we're in right now. And here's what makes it even crazier. Analysts are saying that the most conservative bloc on the court, including Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, might actually join forces with the liberal justices to strike down Trump's tariffs. That would be a rare cross-ideological coalition. That would be liberals and conservatives together saying, no, Trump, you can't do this. That would be the Supreme Court actually putting limits on presidential power, which is exactly what the Constitution is supposed to do. But Trump thought he had locked up the court. He thought his justices would always back him. And now he's finding out that even his own appointees believe in the Constitution more than they believe in loyalty to him. That's incredible. That's the moment where the system actually works. Now let me explain what's actually at stake here and why the justices were so skeptical during those oral arguments. Trump is trying to use a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It's basically a law that gives the president authority to respond to national emergencies related to foreign policy. It was designed for situations like economic sanctions against hostile nations or dealing with threats to American security. But Trump is using it to slap tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of imports coming from countries that aren't hostile to America. He's using it on Canada. He's using it on Mexico. He's using it on Europe. He's basically saying that trade deficits are a national emergency, and I have the power to impose tariffs to fix it. And that's where the justices got skeptical. Because here's the thing, Congress is supposed to have power over trade. The Constitution literally gives Congress the power to regulate foreign commerce. Congress sets tariffs. Congress decides what can come into the country and what can't. The president doesn't have that power. The president has some authority to negotiate trade deals, but not to unilaterally slap tariffs on everything. And Trump is trying to use an emergency law to do exactly that. He's trying to bypass Congress. He's trying to use executive power to do something that the Constitution says Congress is supposed to do. And the justices noticed, come on, you can't just decide that trade deficits are a national emergency, so now you get to be a dictator on trade policy. That's not how the Constitution works. During the oral arguments, Neil Gorsuch asked the Trump administration's lawyer some really pointed questions. Gorsuch is a conservative. He's strict on the Constitution. He believes in limiting executive power. And he basically said, where does this end? If the president can declare trade deficits a national emergency and slap tariffs, what else can he declare an emergency on? Can he declare inflation an emergency and take over the Federal Reserve? Can he declare climate change an emergency and seize factories? Where's the limit? And the Trump administration's lawyer didn't have a good answer, because there isn't one. If Trump's legal theory is right, then there's basically no limit on what a president can do. He just has to call it an emergency and boom, he can do whatever he wants. Amy Coney Barrett, another Trump appointee, also seemed skeptical. She was asking questions about whether the 1977 law really covers what Trump is trying to do. And the answer seemed to be no. The law was designed for specific foreign policy emergencies, not for fixing trade deficits. So Trump is basically stretching the law beyond what it's supposed to do. He's using it in a way it was never intended to be used. And the justices noticed, and other conservative justices seem to notice too. So what you've got is Trump's own court questioning his authority. That's the shock. That's what's got people freaking out in Washington. And here's what makes this even more significant. This is happening in the middle of Trump trying to wield maximum executive power on everything: immigration, trade, deregulation, environmental rules. Trump is trying to use executive power to reshape the entire government. He's trying to bypass Congress on everything. And if the Supreme Court puts limits on his tariff power, that could embolden other challenges to his agenda. It could mean that courts start actually scrutinizing his other executive orders too. It could mean that the Supreme Court is not going to be the rubber stamp that Trump thought it was. That's why Washington is panicking, because Trump's entire second-term strategy depends on him being able to use executive power without limits. And if the courts start checking that power, then his whole agenda is at risk. Now let's talk about the economic implications, because this isn't just about constitutional theory. This is about real money. This is about real people. Trump's tariffs have affected hundreds of billions of dollars in imports. They've driven up prices on goods. They've hurt farmers. They've hurt manufacturers. They've hurt importers. Business groups have been saying this is killing the economy. If the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, then Trump might have to roll back the tariffs. Or worse, he might have to repay the tariffs that he's already collected. That could be hundreds of billions of dollars. That could shake financial markets. That could ripple through the entire economy. And the justices know that. They know that their decision is going to have massive economic consequences. So they're being careful. They're being skeptical. They're asking hard questions because they understand the gravity of what's at stake. Okay, let me break this down into the three main points that you need to understand about what's happening with Trump and the Supreme Court right now. First point, Trump's own justices are questioning whether he has the authority to impose tariffs under the 1977 emergency law. This isn't hypothetical. This happened. Neil Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and other conservative justices openly challenged the Trump administration's legal theory during oral arguments. They asked hard questions. They expressed skepticism. And the Trump administration's lawyer didn't have good answers. That means Trump is in real danger of losing this case. His own court is telling him that what he's doing might be unconstitutional. That's huge. That's the kind of thing that should shock people, because Trump thought he had the court locked up. Second point, if the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, it could force him to roll back hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs, or even repay money that he's already collected from tariffs. That would be an economic earthquake. That would ripple through markets. That would affect prices on consumer goods. That would affect supply chains all around the world. And the justices know this. They're asking hard questions because they understand the magnitude of what's at stake. They're not just thinking about constitutional theory. They're thinking about real-world consequences. And those real-world consequences are massive, so they're being careful, they're being skeptical. And that skepticism is dangerous for Trump, because it suggests they might be willing to strike down his tariffs. Third point, and this is the big one, this exposes the fundamental lie that Trump has been telling himself about the Supreme Court. Trump thought he owned the court. He thought that because he appointed 3 justices, they would always back him up. But what's happening is that his own justices are telling him no. They're telling him the Constitution matters more than loyalty to him. They're telling him that even a president can't just bypass Congress and ignore the separation of powers. That's not loyalty, that's independence. That's exactly what the court is supposed to do. Check executive power. And the fact that Trump's own appointees are doing that job is actually a good sign for the Constitution. It's a sign that the system might still work. Now let's talk about what comes next, because this is where it gets really important. The Supreme Court is going to issue a decision on Trump's tariffs. If they strike down the tariffs, then Trump is going to have to either repay the money or roll back the tariffs. Either way, he loses. Either way, it's a massive blow to his agenda. And if conservative justices are willing to go against Trump on tariffs, then other challenges to his executive orders might succeed too. Other courts might feel emboldened to scrutinize his actions more carefully. This could be the moment where the checks and balances system starts actually working again. This could be the moment where the courts remind Trump that he's not a king, he's the president, and the Constitution limits presidential power. Here's why this matters for everyone watching this unfold. If a president can just declare an emergency and impose tariffs on everything, then what limits exist on presidential power? What's to stop a future president from declaring an emergency and taking over banks or seizing property or doing whatever he wants? The answer is the Constitution, and the court's job is to enforce the Constitution. So if the Supreme Court puts limits on Trump's emergency powers, that's protecting all of us, that's protecting democracy, that's saying even the president has to follow the rules. And that's what the justices seem to be signaling they're going to do. They seem to be saying, we don't care who appointed us, we care about the Constitution. And Trump's tariffs look unconstitutional to us. The irony is absolutely stunning. Trump spent years and years trying to pack the court with conservative justices who he thought would back his agenda. He got 3 justices on the court. He thought he had locked up a 6-3 conservative majority. And then the first time he really pushes his power to the limit, his own justices turn on him. They say no. They say the Constitution matters. They say Congress has power over trade, not the president. That's the opposite of what Trump expected. That's the opposite of what he was counting on. And now he's in a position where he might lose in his own Supreme Court. That's incredible. That's a moment where the system actually works. So to bring it all together, Trump tries to use a 1977 emergency law to impose tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of imports. The Supreme Court holds oral arguments. Trump's own justices grill the administration's lawyer. Conservative and liberal justices both express skepticism, and suddenly Trump's legal theory is in trouble. Trump's entire tariff strategy is in jeopardy, and Trump realizes that even his own court won't just rubber stamp what he wants to do. The Constitution matters, the separation of powers matters, and even a president appointed by Trump has to follow the rules. That's the story. That's why Washington is panicking, because if Trump can lose on tariffs in his own court, then what else can he lose on? What other parts of his agenda are vulnerable? This is the moment where the cracks start appearing in Trump's grip on power. This is the moment where the courts remember that they have a job to do. And that job is to protect the Constitution, not protect the president. Stay tuned, because when this decision comes down, it's going to send shockwaves through the entire Trump administration, and it's going to change the trajectory of his entire second term.